with the project setup, we want to go in and create a tree to start moving that around, and then we want to spawn apples from that tree. And we also need to set up some basic materials. To get started, I'll go and click this drop down here and I'll search for the cylinder. Under shapes, I'll just drag in a cylinder. I'll scale this down to 0.25. In the scale section, I'll scale this down to 0.25 for X and Y, and then for Z, I'll scale that up to 1.75. Right. Then I want to go and add a sphere. Under shapes, drag in a sphere. Now I'll make sure to go and center both of those. So I'll click this on the location. I'll click this to reset the property. And that should center the location out to 0, 0, 0. And of course I want to do the same thing with the sphere. And then I want to move that up in the Z-axis. I'll just navigate around a bit. I'll move that up. And maybe I'll scale that up uniformly. So I'll just go and lock that. I'll scale that up to 1.75. It doesn't matter if there's a bit of a gap, that's fine. I'll just leave it like this. We want to write gameplay code early in the development cycle so that we can test and iterate on our ideas. Because of this, we use simple assets, referred to as programmer art, which we can easily create in the engine itself. This does not require external modeling applications, such as Blender or Modo for example. Programmer art is often simple geometry such as cubes, cylinders and spheres. Now, Unreal Engine 5 actually includes sophisticated modeling tools which allow us to create complex shapes if we need to do that. That is without having to switch to a third-party tool. For this project, however, we will use basic shapes. We can always swap programmer art out for more fancy assets later in the development process. That is, once we have game mechanics that we feel are worth further investment. Next, I want to create a material for this, so I'll go into the content browser, and then I will go into the content section, and I will create a materials folder. Now what we can do is we can go into the engine content. So for example, if I have this, I'll just select this sphere here, and then I'll go to the materials. I'll just click on all here. Then in the material section, I can browse to that particular material, and that should then bring up the engine content. You can see we have the basic shape material. Now what you can do is you can left click and drag and hover over materials, and if you let go, then you can decide if you want to copy that here. Now of course with the engine content you don't want to move or anything like that, so instead I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to create something from scratch. You can go and create a copy of this material, and then you can go and create, let's say, a brown for the tree trunk, green for the leaves and so on. Because if I double click on this, this is already parameterized and everything, so we can create instances, but I'm just going to create that from scratch to show you that. And because of that, I'll just open up the content drawer again, go and turn off show the engine content now, and then I'll go and create a material from scratch instead. So right click, create a material, and I will call that the tree trunk, and I'll click save all, save selected, and that's also going to save what we have in the viewport, just in case we get a crash or something. Double click and I'll dock that. You might be thinking, why are we creating this from scratch? We could have copied the other basic material over and then just change the colors. Well, that's true, but I want to show you how to create instance materials. Remember that if you want to modify the typical material, then we have to recompile that prior to gameplay, whereas with a parameterized material instance, we can go and make modifications without incurring an expensive recompilation. So again, this can improve the material performance, and it also has certain advantages, so we can go and modify the material during gameplay, because again, we don't have to go and recompile that. For example, your parameterized instance material can change during gameplay in response to in-game events. We'll start off by creating something for the base color, which, as you can see here, it defines the overall color of the material. Alright, now if I right click in here and I search for something like color, we will not get exactly what we want. Color is actually float values. So we have a red, green and blue, each one of those represented by a float. And because you have 3 floats for that, you can start to think, well, maybe that's a vector. We can right click and then we can search for vector 3, for example, and then we can left click and then we have a vector 3, which if we click this constant drop down, we have RGB for red, green and blue. And of course you can use this to go and change those values, plug it in into the base color, and you can see that update. Or you can double click in here and then you have the option to go and change that using this color wheel and all of these options that you have. What you can also do is you can right click and you can search for something like scalar. And this will have 1 float instead of 3. We also have hotkeys for these, so instead of searching for them, for example, again right clicking, searching for constant 2 vector, for example, or for scalar or something like that, what we can do instead is we can use the hotkeys. So I'll just press and hold 3 on the keyboard, not on the numpad but on the keyboard, press and hold 3 and then left click, and that will place a vector 3 down, which has the RGB. If I press and hold 2 and left click, then we get a constant 2 vector with R and G, that is with 2 float values. If I press and hold 1 and left click, that is going to give me a scalar that has 1 float value in there. Delete all of that stuff because I want to show you how we can now parameterize this. Parameterizing it means that we give that particular parameter a name that will then expose that particular parameter. So in this case, we can think of that parameter as this particular node that we can then make modifications on in real time if we want to do that. And we can also make modifications to this without having to be recompiled. So what I mean by this is I can right click on this particular node here and then I can convert to parameter. Now I can give this a name. I'll just call this color here. Now you'll actually see this has 4 parameters now, 4 floats I mean. If I go to parameters and I go to color, you can see we have RGBA, A for alpha. So if I press and hold 4 and I left click, again we will get something similar where we have RGBA for that. Under constant you can see we have RGBA. I'll just delete that. But basically this is now something similar to that, but it is parameterized. That is parameterized. I can left click the color and I'll hook that into the base color. Now I also want to create a parameterized scalar which I'll hook into the roughness. So I'll just simply press and hold 1 on the keyboard and left click, and then I can right click on that and then I can convert that to a parameter as well. I'll call that roughness because that is what we want to have that be, and then I'll hook that into the roughness. I will look for the default value on that, the scalar parameter default value, and I'll set that to something like 0.64, and maybe I'll change the color here. I'll double click on here and then I can change that maybe to a lighter color. So I have both of these parameterized now. We'll see how this comes into effect in just a second when we go and instantiate this material. Got a couple more tricks before we move on and actually go and instantiate this material and set this up the way that we want. For the color we can actually press and hold V, and if I left click, press and hold V and left click, that will give us the same thing as we did before. Those shortcuts eliminate a couple of steps. Instead of having to, let's say, press and hold 4, left click, right click on this, convert to a parameter. Okay, instead of doing that, I'll just go and delete that actually. Instead of doing that, also the same thing, if I press and hold 3 and left click, I can go and convert that to a parameter, and you will see that we actually now have 4 of those floats. Okay, so it's basically the same thing once you get that converted. So instead of doing all of those steps, I'll just press and hold V and then left click to get something similar. And then for the scalar, you can just press and hold S, left click, and then you'll get a parameterized scalar. So I will go ahead and save this. You can go and apply this. Apply and save. And now we can actually go and instantiate that. And I'll just go and dock this here in the viewport, bring up a content browser. Just click Save All to make sure that everything is saved. Now actually, since we are going to instantiate this, this is no longer going to be the material for the tree trunk. So I'll right click on that and I'll go and rename that. That is going to be our base material, so I'll rename that to base material. It's also not going to be simply used for our tree because we will use a similar material, an instance of that, for our petals that will make up our basket later on. Okay, so with our base material, I'll right click on that to go and create instances of that. And then I'll go and call that mi is the convention, mi underscore for material instance. And then I'll go and call that tree trunk. And then I'll go and create another one. This one I'll name mi underscore tree leaves. That is going to be the green for the leaves. I'll just save all of that. And now what's this? If I double click, let's say on the tree trunk, I'll double click to open that up. Notice this is not the material editor that we are familiar with. This here is typically what we expect with a material editor. This here is something else, and that's because this is an instance. These are the parameters that are exposed, the roughness and the color. That's because we have parameterized these two. So what I can do is I can go and modify these now. I'll go and check color, and then I can double click in here to get this a picker. I'll make it some brown color and I'll click OK. Now the roughness we are not going to change, so I'll just leave it like that. And I will go and save that, go out of that. And I can drag and drop that onto the tree trunk now. Again, we can go and modify this later on if you want, but I'll just leave it like that. And I'll double click on the leaves. And I want to go and change the color here, so I'll double click on here. I will choose some green color that I like for the leaves. Click OK. I'll click Save. Close that off. Make sure I have those saved. And I'll drag and drop this tree leaves onto the sphere where we want the actual leaves to go. And later on we will create materials for the apple and so on. But for right now, I'll go back to the content folder and I will go and create another folder here. I will call that meshes. And then I'll make sure to left click on the trunk, press and hold Control, and left click on the top sphere where the leaves is supposed to go. I know the background can be a bit confusing, but I'm leaving that there just for debugging so that when we spawn the apples, that we can see that those actually have physics attached and stuff like that. So I'm leaving it in for right now. Okay, so I want to make sure that I have both of these selected. And then we have the actors menu up here, so I'll left click on that. And then I can select to convert those actors to a static mesh. And I can select the folder. If you did not create that folder, then it typically creates a folder like that for you. I'll just demonstrate this to you. So for example, if I have this, I'll just delete that folder. And with these two selected again, I can go to actor, convert to static mesh. It assumes that we want to create a meshes folder. And I'll just call this. I'll call that sm underscore for static mesh underscore tree. Save that, that will create the meshes folder in the content section. And it will create this tree for us. I'll just click save all. Alright. And then I can now go and drag out as many of these trees as I want. And with that, I'll just go ahead and delete all of those things in my viewport. And in the upcoming lectures, we can continue working on this and eventually coding that tree to move to the left and to the right and to spawn some apples.